Some moments are accidents, a spilled drink, a chance meeting. Others feel like fate orchestrated by a force we can't see. In the heart of New York City, at one of its most exclusive restaurants, two worlds were about to collide with the force of a symphony. On one side, Sterling Davenport, a man who could buy anything except the happiness he'd lost. On the other, Isabella Rossi, a waitress who served dreams she could no longer afford to have. The challenge was a cruel joke, a casual display of power. But no one, least of all him, was prepared for her response. Because in the silence between two heartbeats, she was about to remind an entire room that the most valuable things in life are never for sale. The Serafina Club wasn't a restaurant, it was a theater. Every night the same play was performed, a grand spectacle of wealth, power, and influence. The clinking of crystal glasses was the applause, the low murmur of million-dollar deals was the script, and the staff were the silent, invisible stagehands. For Isabella Rossi, her waitress apron felt as heavy as a suit of armor. Each plate she carried, each feigned smile she offered, was a defense against the crushing reality waiting for her outside these gilded walls. At 24, Bella's hands told a story. Her face tried to hide. The skin on her palms was tough from carrying trays, but her fingers were long, slender, and marked with faint, silvery scars on the knuckles, ghosts of a past life. They were pianist's hands now relegated to clearing away half-eaten portions of seared foie gras and truffle risotto. She moved through the opulent dining room with an practiced grace of phantom in a black and white uniform. Her steps were silent, her presence unobtrusive. She had mastered the art of being there but not being seen. Her life was a relentless loop. Wake up at dawn in her tiny Queens apartment. Check on her younger brother, Leo. Get him his morning medication. Then take the subway into the glittering abyss of Manhattan for her double shift. Every dollar, every tip, was a drop in an ocean of debt. Leo, her brilliant, laughing Leo, was trapped in a body betrayed by a rare neurological disorder. The treatments were experimental, astronomically expensive, and the only thing keeping his bright mind from being completely submerged by the creeping paralysis. Their parents had passed away years ago, leaving Bella as his sole guardian, his warrior, his everything. And so she had sacrificed her own everything, a full scholarship to the most prestigious music conservatory in the country, to keep him afloat. Tonight, the air in the Serafina Club was particularly thick with self-importance. The main attraction was the corner booth occupied by Sterling Davenport and his entourage. Davenport was a titan of industry, a man whose picture was a regular feature in business magazines. He was handsome in a severe, sculpted way, with eyes the color of a winter storm and a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite. He exuded an aura of such profound wealth and power that it seemed to bend the light around him. He didn't speak, he pronounced. He didn't smile, he smirked. Bella was assigned to his table. She approached with her usual professional calm, her notepad in hand. "Good evening, gentlemen. May I get you started with something to drink?" Davenport didn't even look at her. He was swirling a glass of amber liquid, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the room. "The Macallan 50, and see to it that the ice is a single, clear sphere. I despise cloudy ice." His voice was a low baritone, smooth, but with an edge of absolute command. His guests, two younger men, in impeccably tailored suits, and a woman draped in diamonds, laughed a little too eagerly. "Only the best for Sterling." One of the men, Robert, chuckled. As Bella turned to leave, her eyes instinctively drifted for a half-second towards the centerpiece of the room, a magnificent Fazioli grand piano. Its polished ebony surface gleamed under the soft recessed lighting, a sleeping giant in the heart of the cacophony. It was both a comfort and a torment. Some nights, she could almost feel the phantom weight of its ivory keys under her fingertips. She would trace the melodies in her mind. Chopin Liszt Rachmaninoff, a silent concert for an audience of one. It was a secret world they couldn't touch, a part of her they couldn't buy. She felt a pang in her chest, a familiar ache of longing so sharp it almost made her gasp. She quickly masked it, her face returning to the neutral canvas of a perfect waitress, and retreated towards the bar. But she hadn't been as invisible as she thought. From his booth, Sterling Davenport's cold eyes had followed her fleeting glance. For the first time all night, he seemed to register her as more than a pair of hands designed to serve him. He saw the flicker of emotion, the raw hunger in her eyes as she looked at the piano. And in the bored, cynical recesses of his mind, an idea, a cruel, entertaining idea, began to form. The dinner progressed as a monument to excess. Bottles of wine that cost more than Bella's monthly rent were ordered sampled and left half-finished. Lobsters were dissected, steaks carved, and conversations revolved around acquisitions mergers and the tiresome burden of extreme wealth. Bella moved in and out of their orbit, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, all while her mind was miles away, calculating pharmacy bills and therapy session costs. "You know," Davenport announced suddenly, his voice cutting through the chatter. He gestured vaguely towards the Fazioli piano. "That instrument costs more than most people's houses. It sits here every night, a silent testament to taste. But it's just an object. Art in places like this is just decoration." Robert, ever the sycophant, nodded vigorously. "Absolutely. It's all about perception. Put a masterpiece in a museum, and it's priceless. Put it in your lobby, and it's just expensive furniture." Davenport took a slow sip of his scotch. His gaze scanned the room, cold and appraising, before it landed once more on Bella, who was standing near a service station, her back to them. "Take our waitress, for example," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. Bella froze. Her name hadn't been used, but she knew he was talking about her. She could feel the eyes of the entire table on her back. "She's been staring at that piano all night." He continued, a smirk playing on his lips. "I'm sure, like every other person who took a few lessons as a child, she imagines she has some hidden talent. A dream she gave up. The world is full of people with hidden talents. It's a cliché." The woman at the table, a socialite named Cassandra, let out a tinkling, condescending laugh. "Oh, you're terrible, Sterling. Leave the poor girl alone." But Davenport was warming to his theme. He was bored, and he had found his evening's entertainment. "No, this is a perfect illustration. Authenticity is dead. It's all a performance. The hard-working waitress with the secret soul of an artist. It's a story we tell ourselves to feel better. I'll bet you $1,000 I can prove it." He raised his voice slightly, a clear command. "Miss over here." Bella's heart pounded against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to pretend she hadn't heard, to melt into the shadows. But that wasn't an option. With a deep, steadying breath, she turned and walked back to the table, her face a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality. "Yes, sir." Davenport leaned back, his eyes glinting with a predatory amusement. "We were just having a philosophical discussion. Tell me, do you play?" He gestured towards the piano with his glass. The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Bella's mind raced. A simple no would end it. But the lie felt like a betrayal of everything she had been, of the girl who spent 10 hours a day, practicing until her fingers bled, of the parents who had believed in her with every fiber of their being. "I used to," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The answer was exactly what he wanted. "I used to." The two saddest words in the English language, he mused to his audience. He then fixed his gaze on her, his expression hardening into a challenge. "I have a proposition for you. I'll give you $10,000 if you go over there and play something for us. Anything at all." A collective gasp went through his guests. Robert looked at him bewildered. "Sterling, what are you doing?" Davenport ignored him. $10,000. Cash. Right now. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a money clip thick with $100 bills, tossing it onto the table with a dismissive thud. The silver clip engraved with the initials SD gleamed under the soft light. Bella stared at the money. $10,000. It was 2 months of Leo's most critical medication. It was the overdue rent. It was a brief, precious moment of breathing room in a life defined by suffocation. But the price was her soul. He wasn't offering her a stage. He was offering her a cage. He wanted to make a fool of her to prove his cynical point to his vapid friends. He wanted her to plink out a clumsy, half-forgotten tune so he could laugh and say, "See, I told you so." The humiliation would be staggering a public execution of her most private and sacred dream. Her manager, Mr. Dubois, a perpetually stressed man with a kind heart, hidden under a gruff exterior, hurried over sensing trouble. "Davenport, is there a problem, sir?" "No problem at all, Jean-Pierre," Davenport said smoothly. "I was just making your employee a very generous offer. A little evening entertainment." Mr. Dubois looked from Davenport's cruel smirk to Bella's pale, stricken face. He knew Bella was a good worker, quiet and reliable. He didn't know her story, but he saw the predatory nature of the scene. "Sir, I must ask you not to bother my staff." "It's all right, Mr. Dubois," Bella heard herself say. The words came out before she had even consciously decided. The sight of the money, the thought of what it could do for Leo, had overridden her pride. Her dignity was a luxury she couldn't afford. What was one more humiliation in a life that was already full of them? She looked directly at Sterling Davenport, her brown eyes meeting his stormy grey ones. For a moment the waitress was gone, and in her place was a woman made of steel. "You want me to play?" she asked, her voice steady now. "Fine, but if I do this, you and your guests will listen. No talking, no laughing. You will listen until I am finished." Davenport was taken aback by her sudden fortitude. A slow, intrigued smile spread across his face. "You have yourself a deal." Mr. Dubois looked at her, his eyes wide with alarm. "Isabella, you don't have to do this." "Yes," she whispered more to herself than to him. "I do." She untied the strings of her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on a nearby service tray. The simple act felt monumental, like a shedding of skin. As she walked towards the Fazioli, a hush began to fall over the nearby tables. People were sensing that something unusual was happening. The air grew thick with anticipation and confusion. Bella felt hundreds of eyes on her, but she saw none of them. Her entire world had narrowed to the 88 keys waiting for her in the center of the room. The walk to the piano felt like a mile. Each step was a drumbeat, marking the seconds of her impending humiliation. or far less likely her vindication. The low murmur of the restaurant had died down completely. The only sounds were the distant clatter from the kitchen and the frantic thumping of her own heart. She could feel Sterling Davenport's gaze on her, heavy and smug, waiting for the clumsy, discordant notes that would prove his point. She reached the piano and slid on to the plush leather bench. The wood was cool and smooth beneath her fingers. For a moment she just sat there, breathing in the faint scent of polish and old wood. She ran a hand gently over the fallboard, her touch reverent. This instrument was a marvel of craftsmanship, a living thing with a soul of sound trapped inside it. It had been so long. Too long. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. What if he was right? What if her talent had withered and died from neglect like a plant left in a dark room? What if all that came out was a pathetic ghost of the music that once lived in her? She closed her eyes, shutting out the sea of curious and condescending faces. She pictured Leo's smile, the one he gave her in his good moments, a flash of the brilliant boy unburdened by his illness. She thought of her mother, a piano teacher with a laugh like wind chimes, who first placed her small hands on the keys and told her, "Music is the language of the soul, Isabella. Never forget how to speak it." She took one last deep breath and opened her eyes. She placed her hands over the keys, the familiar spacing a comfort to her muscle memory. There was no hesitation. There was no tentative search for a note. Her fingers descended, and the first notes of Frédéric Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor ripped through the silence of the restaurant. It wasn't a gentle beginning. It was a question, a dark and sorrowful lament that immediately seized the room. The sound that erupted from the fazioli was not the timid tinkling of a hobbyist. It was rich, resonant, and impossibly complex. It was a sound born of anguish and passion, of countless hours of devotion. The whole room gasped. It wasn't a polite, feigned surprise. It was a genuine collective intake of breath, a sonic shock wave of disbelief. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Heads whipped around, searching for the source of the sublime, heart-breaking sound. At his table, Sterling Davenport's smirk vanished. It didn't just fade. It shattered as if struck by a physical blow. His glass halfway to his lips froze in midair. His eyes, which had been alight with cruel amusement, were now wide with stunned confusion. This wasn't the clumsy rendition of Für Elise he had expected. This was a masterpiece being executed with a level of technical skill and emotional depth that belonged on the stage of Carnegie Hall, not in the dining room of the Serafina Club. Bella was no longer in the restaurant. She was lost in the music, her body swaying with the tempestuous rhythm. Her hands, which had carried heavy trays just minutes before, were now a blur of controlled fury and delicate grace. They flew across the keyboard, coaxing a storm from the strings. The music told a story of loss, of defiance, of a desperate, raging beauty. It was her story. Every frustration, every tear, every ounce of her fear for Leo and her grief for the life she had lost was being poured into the piece. The notes were her words, the chords her screams, the quiet passages her prayers. The piece escalated, reaching its ferocious and technically demanding climax. The coda of the first ballade is a notoriously difficult passage, a torrent of sound that requires superhuman dexterity and power. Bella didn't just play it, she conquered it. The sound was a tidal wave washing over the room, an expression of raw, untamed genius that was both terrifying and breathtakingly beautiful. Sterling Davenport felt a cold dread creep up his spine. It wasn't just that the waitress was a prodigy, it was the music itself. He knew this piece. He knew it in his bones, in the deepest, most guarded chambers of his heart. It was the piece his mother, a concert pianist, who had given up her career for him, used to play on rainy afternoons. It was the last piece he ever heard her play before the illness took her. He had buried that memory under decades of ambition and cynicism, locked it away in a vault he never intended to open. And now this waitress, this complete stranger, had just picked the lock. As the final thunderous chords reverberated through the room, she held them, letting the sound hang in the air for a perfect heart-stopping moment before it faded into absolute profound silence. Bella's hands dropped from the keys, trembling from the exertion. She sat hunched over her chest, heaving the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. She slowly lifted her head, her gaze sweeping across the room. No one moved. No one breathed. The entire dining room, filled with some of the most powerful and jaded people in New York City, was frozen in a state of collective awe. The woman in diamonds, Cassandra, had tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. Robert's mouth was hanging open, but Bella's eyes found Sterling Davenport. He was pale, his knuckles white where he gripped his glass. His face was a mask of shock grief, and something else she couldn't name recognition. The cruel, arrogant millionaire was gone. In his place was a man who looked utterly and completely broken. In that moment, she knew she hadn't just won his bet. She had inadvertently unearthed a ghost from his past, and the haunting had just begun. The silence that followed the final note was more profound than any sound. It was a vacuum filled with the unspoken emotions of every person in the room. It stretched for what felt like an eternity, a shared moment of suspended reality. Then someone from a corner table, an elderly man with tears in his eyes, began to clap. Hesitantly at first, then with more conviction. He was quickly joined by another, and then another, until the entire restaurant erupted in a thunderous, spontaneous, standing ovation. The applause was a roar, a wave of sound that washed over Bella, but she barely heard it. She felt disoriented, as if waking from a long, intense dream. The world rushed back in the faces of the patrons, the concerned look on Mr. Dubois's face, the gleaming piano before her. She slid off the bench, her legs feeling unsteady. The performance had drained her of everything. She wanted to run to find a quiet corner and piece herself back together. But before she could move, a distinguished silver-haired man from Davenport's table was standing before her. He wasn't one of the fawning investors. He had a calm, scholarly air about him. "Young lady," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with authority. "My name is Professor Alistair Finch." He extended a hand. Bella took it numbly. His handshake was firm and respectful. "I am the head of the piano department at the Juilliard School. That was the most extraordinary rendition of the G minor ballade I have heard in over a decade." "Who was your tutor?" "Juilliard." The name hit Bella like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. It was the school of her dreams, the place she had worked her entire young life to get into the future she had sacrificed. My mother taught me." She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Professor Finch's eyes, a piercing blue, studied her with intense curiosity and professional admiration. "Your mother was a phenomenal teacher. You have a gift, Miss—" "Rossi," she supplied. "Isabella Rossi." "Miss Rossi," he said, pulling a card from his wallet. A gift like yours does not belong on the floor of a restaurant unless you are the one being served. Please call me. I insist." Bella stared at the embossed card in her hand. Professor Alistair Finch. The Juilliard School. It felt like a relic from another universe, a life she wasn't allowed to live. Her attention was pulled back to the booth. Sterling Davenport had finally moved. He pushed himself to his feet and walked towards her, his movements stiff, robotic. His friends watched him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and apprehension. He stopped a few feet away from her, the thick wad of cash still clutched in his hand. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by an expression of raw, unreadable turmoil. He extended the money to her. "You won," he said, his voice raspy, hollow. Bella looked at the cash, then back at his face. The money was the reason she had done this, the reason she had subjected herself to this trial. But now, looking at it, it felt dirty, insignificant. It was the prize for a cruel game, and seeing the look on his face, she felt no sense of victory, only a profound sadness. She took the money, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was cold as ice. "Thank you," she said softly. "Who are you?" He asked the question, abrupt, almost desperate. It wasn't an inquiry about her name. It was a demand for an explanation. How could she, a waitress, possess such a power? How could she know that piece of music? Before Bella could answer, Mr. Dubois was at her side, his arm gently guiding her away. "That's enough, Mr. Davenport. The show is over. Isabella, your shift ended 10 minutes ago. Go home." He was shielding her, protecting her, his earlier gruffness replaced by a fierce paternal instinct. Bella gave him a grateful look and allowed him to lead her towards the staff area. As she walked away, she could feel Sterling Davenport's eyes burning into her back. The applause had died down, and the restaurant was slowly returning to its normal hum, but the atmosphere had been irrevocably altered. The play had been interrupted by a moment of undeniable, shocking truth. In the locker room, Bella sank onto a bench, her body trembling. She clutched the money in one hand and Professor Finch's card in the other. One represented her present reality, a desperate scramble for survival. The other represented a past she had buried, a future she had thought was impossible. She felt dizzy, her emotions, a tangled mess of triumph, shame, grief, and a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. She changed out of her uniform and into her street clothes, the movements automatic. She needed to get home. She needed to see Leo. He was her anchor, her North Star in this chaotic night. As she slipped out the restaurant's side exit into the cool night air, a voice called her name. "Miss Rossi." She turned. Sterling Davenport was standing there alone under the dim glow of a street lamp. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore, and his tie was loosened. Without the armor of his corporate persona, he looked younger and strangely lost. I need to talk to you," he said, taking a step forward. Bella flinched, clutching her purse tighter. "You paid me. We're done." "No," he said, his voice strained. "It's not about the money. That music. Where did you learn to play it like that?" "Why that piece?" There was a genuine anguish in his voice that stopped her from turning away. She saw now that this was no longer about a rich man and a waitress. Something much deeper had been broken open tonight. "It was my mother's favorite," she answered honestly, her voice quiet in the vastness of the city night. "It was the first piece she ever taught me, that made me feel like I wasn't just playing notes. I was telling a story." A pained, haunted look crossed Davenport's face. He looked away towards the endless river of headlights on the street. "It was my mother's favorite, too," he said, his voice so low she could barely hear it. She was a pianist. She taught it to me." The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge between two completely different worlds. Bella stared at him, at this powerful broken man, and realized the cruel challenge had never really been about her at all. It was a fight he had been having with himself, with a ghost she had accidentally summoned with a melody. The whole room had gasped at her music, but the person whose world had truly been shattered was the one who had dared her to play. Sterling Davenport's penthouse apartment was a testament to minimalist wealth. It was a vast expanse of glass, steel, and white marble overlooking Central Park, so high up that the city below looked like a silent, glittering circuit board. The space was immaculate, sterile, and profoundly empty. It was the home of a man who had everything and owned nothing of value. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of scotch in his hand. Not the 50-year-old Macallan, but a cheap, fiery whiskey he kept for nights like this. He hadn't been able to shake the music. It echoed in the silence of his apartment, in the hollows of his memory. Isabella Rossi's performance had done more than shock him. It had excavated a part of his soul he thought he had successfully entombed. He closed his eyes, and he was a boy again, small for his age, sitting beside his mother, Catherine Davenport, at their family's Steinway. Her scent was a mix of lavender and sheet music. Her fingers, so much like the waitress's, were long and graceful as they danced across the keys, filling their sun-drenched living room with the passionate sorrow of Chopin's ballade. She wasn't just playing, she was breathing. The music was her lifeblood. "You feel that, Sterling," she would say, her voice soft. "It's a story of a struggle, of finding beauty, even in the darkest of places. You have this in you, too. Never let anyone take it away." She had been a prodigy herself, destined for the world's great stages. But she had met his father, a ruthless businessman, who saw her music as a charming hobby, but not a respectable career. She chose love, she chose family, and she poured all her passion and ambition into her son. Sterling had inherited her gift. He was a natural, his talent raw and immense. For years the piano was his sanctuary, the one place where he and his mother connected on a level beyond words. But his father's influence was a slow-acting poison. "Music is a fine pastime, son," he would say, "but it doesn't build empires. Power isn't in a melody, it's in a balance sheet." When Sterling was 17, his mother was diagnosed with a degenerative illness, a slow, cruel disease that first attacked her hands. The tremors started, her fingers grew stiff. The music became a struggle, then an impossibility. The silence she left behind was louder than any symphony. A year later, she was gone. At her funeral, his father had placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "She would want you to be strong, to be successful." In his grief and anger, Sterling saw music as a weakness, a source of his mother's pain and unfulfilled dreams. He locked the piano room. He went to business school. He embraced his father's world with a vengeance, building an empire that dwarfed even his father's. He became a man who dealt in facts, figures, and acquisitions. He had systematically purged every trace of his mother's softness from his life trading Chopin for stock tickers, passion for profit. The cynical bet at the restaurant. It hadn't been a random act of cruelty. He had seen the longing in Isabella Rossi's eyes as she looked at the piano, and it had stirred something ugly in him, a resentment for the dreamer he had once been. He had wanted to mock her, to crush that hope, to prove to himself that his choice had been the right one. that dreams were flimsy, worthless things in the real world. And she had answered with his mother's song. She had played it with the same fire, the same soul-bearing honesty. It was as if his mother's ghost had walked into that restaurant, sat down at that piano, and called him a liar to his face. He picked up his phone and dialed his head of security, a former Mossad agent named Ben. Ben, I need you to find out everything you can about a woman named Isabella Rossi. She works as a waitress at the Serafina Club. Everything. I want to know where she lives, her family, her history. Be discreet. The next afternoon, a sleek, encrypted file appeared on his tablet. Sterling opened it, his heart pounding with a strange mix of dread and anticipation. He scrolled through the details of her life, and a knot of shame tightened in his gut. He saw it all. The death of her parents, the full music scholarship to Juilliard she had won at 18, and then deferred year after year until it expired. And then he saw the reason her brother Leo Rossi. The file contained his medical history, a devastating litany of failed treatments and mounting bills for his rare neurological condition, spinocerebellar ataxia type 7. He read the names of the hospitals, the specialists, the experimental drug trials. And then he saw a name that made the blood drain from his face. The primary pharmaceutical company, developing and supplying the most promising and most expensive experimental treatment for Leo's condition, was OmniHealth Solutions. OmniHealth Solutions was a subsidiary of Davenport Industries. He owned it. Sterling fell back into his chair as if he'd been punched. The cruelty of the irony was staggering. He in his gilded tower had been profiting from the very desperation that had driven this brilliant, gifted woman to serve him drinks and endure his contempt. The $10,000 he had thrown on the table as a pittance, a tool for his arrogant game, was a droplet of the fortune her family had likely paid into his corporate coffers. His challenge hadn't just been a cruel joke. It had been a monstrous act of cosmic injustice. He had taken a woman who was sacrificing her genius to pay one of his companies, and he had tried to humiliate her for his own amusement. The ghost of his mother's music no longer just echoed in the room. It was screaming at him. For the first time in over 2 decades, Sterling Davenport felt the full, crushing weight of his own moral bankruptcy. He had spent his life building an empire of things, only to realize he had constructed a kingdom of profound, suffocating emptiness. And a waitress with calloused hands had just shown him the price of his own soul. The next evening, a persistent autumn rain was falling over New York City, washing the streets in a slick, melancholic sheen. It was the kind of night that made people rush from one warm place to another, heads bowed under umbrellas. Bella was walking home from the subway station, her mind still a whirlwind from the events of the previous night. Professor Finch's business card felt heavy in her pocket, a constant nagging reminder of a door that had been cracked open. The $10,000 was already gone, wired to the specialty pharmacy, before she'd even had her morning coffee. It was a relief, a temporary dam against the flood, but she knew the flood was relentless. The relief felt hollow. The performance had dredged up all the pain of her lost dreams, leaving her feeling more adrift than ever. As she turned onto her quiet residential street in Queens, she saw a black town car parked at the curb, its engine silent. Standing beside it, holding a large black umbrella, was Sterling Davenport. Her first instinct was to turn and run. She wanted nothing more to do with this man who represented the casual cruelty of a world she despised. But he had seen her, and he took a step forward into the dim circle of a streetlight. He wasn't dressed in his usual power suit, but in dark trousers and a simple grey cashmere sweater. The rain slicked his dark hair to his forehead, and in the gloomy light, He looked less like a corporate raider and more like a man bearing a heavy burden. "Miss Rossi," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual arrogance. "Isabella, can I please have 5 minutes of your time?" She clutched the strap of her bag, her knuckles white. "If this is about the money, I can't give it back. It's already gone." "I know," he said, and the way he said it made her pause. There was no judgment in his tone, only a deep, weary resignation. "It's not about the money. Not anymore." He took another step closer, holding the umbrella so that it partly shielded her from the drizzle. "I didn't come here to ask for anything. I came to apologize. What I did at the restaurant was inexcusable. It was arrogant, cruel, and I am profoundly sorry." The apology was so direct, so devoid of excuses, that it caught her off guard. She had expected justifications, or perhaps another, more insidious offer, not this raw, simple confession. She remained silent, watching him waiting. "The piece you played," he began, then hesitated, as if the words were physically difficult to say. "My mother. It was her piece. She taught it to me before she died. When you played it, you played it like she did, with the same heart." He looked down at the wet pavement. "I've spent 20 years trying to forget that. You made me remember." Bella felt a crack in her wall of resentment. She saw a flicker of the boy. He must have been the one who loved his mother and her music. "But that's not the only reason I'm here," he continued, looking up, his grey eyes meeting hers. They were filled with a shame so palpable she could almost feel it. "I know about your brother Leo. I know about his condition. And I know that the primary company managing his experimental treatment is Omni Health Solutions." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. "It's one of my companies."
Tall fun.
Bella felt the world tilt on its axis. The rain, the streetlights, the entire city seemed to spin. Of all the cruel twists of fate, this was the most grotesque. The man who had mocked her dream was the same man profiting from her nightmare. The rage that rose in her was so potent, so pure, it burned away her fear. "You knew," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You knew, and you put me on display like that. Was that part of the game, to see how the little mouse would dance for the man who holds her brother's life in his hands?" "No," he said, his voice cracking with urgency. "God, no. I had no idea until this morning. I swear to you. I had my security team look into your situation, because I couldn't understand. I needed to know who you were. When I found out, when I saw the connection." He trailed off, shaking his head in self-disgust. "There are no words to describe how monstrous it is." He looked at her, his face a portrait of desperation and remorse. "I can't undo what I did. I can't take back the humiliation or the arrogance. But I can try to make it right. I want to cover all of Leo's medical expenses, all of them, from this day forward. The best doctors, the best treatments, any facility in the world. He will get the best care, and it will not cost you another cent. This isn't charity," he added, quickly seeing the proud defiance flash in her eyes. "This is a debt. My company owes it to him. I owe it to you." Bella was speechless, her mind struggling to process the offer. It was everything she had ever prayed for. It was freedom. It was a future for Leo. But it was being offered by the man she despised, a man whose hands were, however indirectly, stained with her family's struggle. "And there's something else," he said, his voice softer now. "Professor Finch, he called me. He said your talent is generational. He wants you to audition for the artist diploma program at Juilliard. It's the highest level of performance, study invitation only." He took a deep breath. "I want to sponsor you. A full scholarship, living expenses, a new piano for your apartment, whatever you need, so you never have to choose between your gift and your family again." He stood there in the rain, stripped of all his power and wealth, offering her back the two halves of her broken life, her brother's health, and her own future. It was a penance, an act of atonement so grand it was terrifying. Bella looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the profound, gut-wrenching truth in his eyes. He wasn't trying to buy her forgiveness. He was trying to buy back a piece of his own soul. The ghost his mother had sent in the form of a waitress had given him a chance to change the end of his own story. Tears welled in her eyes, mingling with the raindrops on her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness or anger anymore. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking, complicated release. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do all this?" Sterling Davenport looked away towards the dark windows of her apartment building where her brother was sleeping. "Because my mother once told me that music is the language of the soul," he said, echoing her own words from the night before. "And for the first time in 20 years, I'm trying to remember how to speak it." The 6 months that followed were like the slow, deliberate composition of a new piece of music. The chaotic, dissonant chords of Bella's old life began to resolve into a new, more hopeful harmony. The autumn rain that had witnessed Sterling Davenport's confession gave way to the quiet, introspective blanket of winter, and then finally to the tentative, vibrant green of a New York spring. Each season marked a profound shift, not just in the world outside, but in the landscape of her soul. The changes began with sound. The oppressive silence of her tiny queen's apartment, once broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the rustle of overdue bills, was shattered by the arrival of the Schimmel upright. It wasn't the imposing, intimidating Fazioli from the Serafina Club, a monument to a world she could never join. This piano was different. Its polished walnut finish was warm, its size perfectly suited for the small living room. It was hers. When the movers had gone, she sat before it for a full hour, her hands hovering over the keys, a sea of emotions too vast to navigate. Then tentatively, she played a simple C major scale. The notes were clear, bright, and full of promise. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock, opening a door she thought was sealed forever. Her days found a new rhythm orchestrated by the steady ticking of a metronome. The life of a waitress with its endless cycle of physical exhaustion and mental numbness was a fading memory. In its place was the life of an artist, which she discovered was a different, more profound kind of exhaustion. It was a joyous, maddening, all-consuming labor. There were days of euphoric breakthrough where her fingers would fly across the keys, effortlessly translating the complex language of the composers into pure emotion. And there were days of frustrating struggle where her hands felt like clumsy blocks of stone. The muscle memory of her youth, a faint ghost she couldn't quite grasp. On those days, she would fight for a single, perfect phrase for hours, the memory of her mother's patient voice, her only guide. Professor Alistair Finch was her anchor and her compass. He was a stern taskmaster, a man who demanded nothing less than perfection, but his strictness was tempered by a deep, almost paternal understanding. "The years away did not weaken you, Isabella," he told her during one difficult session after she had struggled with a complex passage from Ravel. They gave you something the other students, the ones who have never known anything but practice rooms, will never have. They gave you gravitas. You felt the weight of the world. Now your job is not to forget that weight, but to learn how to make it fly. Your pain is not your cage. It is the core of your power. Use it. Leo's transformation was the most beautiful melody of all. The move to the Specialized Neurological Institute in Boston had worked wonders. Sterling's funding had removed all barriers, giving Leo access to cutting-edge therapies and the undivided attention of the world's best doctors. Bella's weekly video calls with him became the highlight of her existence. The sallow, tired boy was replaced by a vibrant young man whose eyes sparkled with their old intelligence and mischief. "Check this out, Bella," he said, during one call, a huge grin on his face. He slowly, deliberately lifted a glass of water to his lips, with a hand that barely trembled. It was a simple act, a monumental victory. "The physical therapist says I have the grip strength of a slightly menacing kitten now. Next week, we're aiming for a moderately annoyed house cat." His laughter, clear and unburdened, was the sweetest music she had ever heard. He was enrolling in online university courses, his brilliant mind finally unleashed. Her correspondence with Sterling Davenport remained a strange, formal counterpoint to the richness of her new life. He was an invisible force, a name on a bank transfer, a brief signature at the bottom of an email. Once a month, she would send a meticulously polite update on Leo's progress and her own studies. His replies were always prompt, professional, and devoid of emotion. "Thank you for the update. I am pleased to hear of his progress. All associated invoices have been settled. SD." She didn't know what to make of him. The man in the rain, the one who had spoken of his mother with such profound grief, was a ghost. In his place was the efficient, distant CEO. Perhaps it was his way of maintaining a boundary, of acknowledging that his atonement did not entitle him to her friendship or forgiveness. She was grateful for the distance. It allowed her to accept his help without feeling beholden to the man who had for one night been her tormentor. His money was rebuilding her life, but it was a life she was determined to make her own. The day of her audition for the Artist Diploma program arrived on a sun-drenched morning in May. The air was warm, filled with the scent of blossoms from Central Park. Bella woke up feeling a profound, terrifying calm. The frantic anxiety that had been her constant companion for years was gone. In its place was a quiet, focused energy. She was ready. As she rode the subway to Lincoln Center, she watched the city blur past. It was the same route she had taken countless times to the Serafina Club, but today she felt like a different person on a different planet. She was no longer a phantom in a uniform, invisible to the world. She was Isabella Rossi, a musician, and she was on her way to claim the life she had been promised. Backstage at Juilliard's Paul Recital Hall, the air was thick with history and hushed reverence. The scent of polished wood, old velvet, and nervous energy was intoxicating. She could hear the muffled, distant sound of another auditioner, a violinist playing a frantic Paganini caprice. Her heart began to pound, the old fear threatening to surface. She closed her eyes, picturing Leo's smiling face, her mother's gentle hands on hers. Her phone vibrated in her small clutch. She frowned, not expecting any messages. She opened it to see a text from an unknown number. Her breath caught. "My mother always said, 'Don't play the notes, tell the story.' Break a leg, Isabella. SD." A slow, complicated smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had communicated with her, outside their formal email exchanges. It was a simple message, but it was everything. It was an acknowledgement of their shared history, of the ghost of the woman who had inadvertently brought them together. It was permission, and it was a blessing. She texted back a single heartfelt word. "Thank you." "Miss Rossi," a stage manager's voice called from the doorway. "We're ready for you." Walking onto that stage was like stepping into a dream. The lights were blindingly bright, casting the small panel of judges in the audience into shadow. In the center of it all, bathed in a pool of golden light, was the concert grand piano. It was a magnificent instrument, a Fazioli the same make as the one from the restaurant. But as she approached it, she felt no intimidation, no echo of that past humiliation. This was not a prop in a rich man's theater. This was a conduit. This was an altar. She sat adjusting the bench, feeling the familiar weight and balance of it. She took a moment, letting the silence of the great hall settle around her. She looked at her hands poised over the keys. These were the hands that had served, that had cleaned, that had fought, that had grieved, and now they would speak. Professor Finch had expected her to play the Chopin Ballade. He had told her it was her signature piece, the one that best showcased her technical ferocity and emotional depth. It was the safe, brilliant choice. But as her fingers touched the ivory, she knew she couldn't play it. The ballade was the sound of her past, a story of grief and defiance born in a moment of desperation. Today was not about defiance. It was about gratitude. It was about rebirth. Instead, her hands found the opening chords of Robert Schumann's Arabesque in C major. The piece began not with a storm, but with a sunrise. The gentle lyrical melody unfurled into the hall a story of grace, of hope, of finding beauty after a long and difficult winter. It was a far more vulnerable choice, its technical demands hidden beneath a surface of poetic simplicity. But its emotional demand was to be open, to be sincere, to be free. She played with a mastery that silenced the room. The music flowed through her, a current of pure, unburdened joy. This was not a performance fueled by anger or a need to prove herself. This was an offering. It was a thank you to her parents, to Leo, to Professor Finch, and even in a complicated way to Sterling. It was her soul finally speaking its own language again, fluent and healed, telling a story not of where she had been, but of all the places she had yet to go. When the final delicate note faded into the vast silence of the hall, she let her hands rest on the keys. She took a deep, steadying breath, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt completely and utterly home. Isabella's story reminds us that beneath the surface of the everyday, the tired waitress, the quiet barista, the clerk at the grocery store, there might lie an extraordinary talent, a forgotten dream, just waiting for a chance to be heard. It shows us that a single moment of connection, even one born from cruelty, can change the course of a life forever. It's a powerful testament to the idea that it's never too late for a second chance, not just for the person with the hidden gift, but for the one who has forgotten how to listen. True wealth isn't what you own, it's what you're able to awaken in others and in yourself. If this story moved you, please give this video a like. It helps us share more tales like this with the world. Don't forget to share it with someone who might need a reminder of the magic hidden in plain sight. And for more stories that inspire and touch the heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Thank you for listening.